Hello YouTubers, Joe Kersey here on July 25th, 2014 around 4:30, not 4:30, I'm sorry, 2:30 in the afternoon Eastern Daylight Time. Now, despite the big red dirt truck behemoth rolling by, I thought I'd give you a little taste, little view of our cathedral area here out front. I'm going to have to do something about that pole. I got to adjust this. Nonetheless, I'm sure you guys can factor out that handle there. Kind of enjoy with me this wonderful area that God has allowed us to work with Him to help create. Of course, the emerald ash beetles help sort of decreate some of that, but still, you know, you're getting light to the forest floor here. You know, things are changing. It's been a 32-year process out here, and hopefully for another 32 years or so. I was going to do my day's offering on the porch today, but I decided, well, out front, in the front actually, but I thought, well, let's not change a winning formula. Here's my pantry. You can see all my canned goods. Some tuna fish there. A can of soup and some bean sprouts. You've seen the various book stacks and so forth. Haven't had to run the fan but 2 days here this summer. Here's a strange sight in this household. Look. Joe's got his computer turned down there. Well, that didn't happen until but a few minutes ago. So here we are. I'm going to do a little. Well, today I'm going to tell you the story of my mother's last few hours. I thought, given that it's Paul's 60th birthday and therefore the anniversary of a day in which somebody came into the world, I might talk about a day in which somebody left the world. Well, this world anyway. The human dimension entered into maybe the presence of the divine dimension. I imagine she probably did. Despite a couple of the stunts she pulled. Well, I mean, so can we all hope, huh? So, I thought I'd start by reading you. Boy, I've got hours of stuff in this. A Mom's Last Days in the Rest Home Haiku. If no eat, you die. If eat, they use thickening. Just matter of time. Well, like all short poetic forms, you have to sort of fill in the blanks. Well, it turns out that for the longest time before my mother ended up being carted off to the rest home, when she had gotten herself down to, oh my word, 59 pounds. This is a woman, now admittedly she was about 4'9". But she had sort of starved herself down to 59 pounds. And, you know, I won't tell you how I went down and found her, but anyway, that's how she was when I found her. And now I'd been going down every 10 days and 2 weeks and taking her food, so it wasn't like she had actually been giving me grocery lists, and I'd buy them and take them down, and I would actually cook food for her and take her down about 3 or 4 or 5 prepared meals that she could put in the freezer and then just heat up. Turns out after her death, all of these meals were found buried very, very deep in the chest freezer out on the back porch, rather than the freezer that I put them in the refrigerator in the kitchen. So she clearly, there was clearly something a little going amiss here. Well, anyway, so yeah, she finally ended up in a very nice rest home facility. It wasn't one of these rest home horror shows that you hear about on the various, 2020s and Datelines and things like that. So they fatten her up. All by mouth. None of this feeding tube nonsense and that. Well, she wouldn't have allowed that, and indeed had documents not allowing that. And I don't think my sister and I would have allowed that either. Because she adamantly did not want that sort of interventional feeding in the sense of where they have to cram something into you to feed you. But they fattened her up. They got her swallowing enough stuff to eat. And they got her all spiffed up. And hell, she got up, I think she got up to almost just under 100 pounds. She got up to like 98 pounds. Which for a 4'9" woman's not, that's very adequate weight. And she looked kind of plump, actually. But then, the median stay in a rest home, once you go in and once you are carried out the back door for the last time, it's somewhere between 18 months and 2 years. Turns out hers was going to be 21 months. So, getting toward the what we'll call the last sort of 5 or 6 months of her stay there, she started to get the dwindles again. They had to sort of hound. She was in assisted living. They had to hound her a little bit more to get out of bed and get dressed and, maintain that kind of studied, chirpy polyester lifestyle required of all the residents in these places. You're not allowed to be moody and retreat into your little lair, you have to go out and interact. So, and I'll tell you, these people were really good. These people wouldn't let you. These people, they didn't quite have the shoot the straggler mentality that a lot of these places do, but they kept you on the move, and of course that keeps your blood circulating and the clots out of your legs, and the sores off your butt, and this, that, and the other. But inevitably, as it always happens, she started getting a little bit of these little sacral breakdown, a bed sore, if you will. They used to piss her off so much. I'd go in there and say, well, you got a bed sore. She'd say, I don't have a bed sore. I said, well, yes, you do. I said, it's not your fault necessarily. It's not the nurse. I mean, because it wasn't the nurse's fault. I mean, these guys were coming in here, turning her and tending to her. I mean, I can't really say too much about this place, but nonetheless, you know, when needs must be to break down, needs must be to break down, and that's what was happening to her. So, and of course, what you get is you get infection in that bed sore. Well, you know, not maybe infection in terms of a closed space abscess infection, but you get infection, you get a skin infection. What's the equivalent of a skin infection? What's the equivalent of a strep skin infection? And there are various strains of strep that will, over time, affect the kidneys with an immune response in the glomeruli, and you get this glomerulonephritis from streptococcal skin infection, or as a result of. It's not actually it's not a bacterial infection, but it's a immune response syndrome to having a strep skin infection. And so eventually she went into renal failure. She went into chronic renal failure first. You know, her creatinine crept up to like 2.5, 3. But her BUN stayed, you know, she was never all that high. You know, she was hydrated, she was putting out urine. And, you know, and she was getting treated appropriately, you know, with the Lasix and appropriate fluid management. But, and I think she had a brief spell in the hospital for like a day or two, and then they brought her back, and then she ended up in there for the last, you know, sort of what would be the last time. And this time, of course, then the renal failure had progressed to acute renal failure. No urine output. What urine output there was bloody, and so, you know, I got the word, my sister got the word. I got down there a little bit first, I think. Well, first this time, because my sister had to drive down from Michigan, and I had to drive down from Columbus. And this was in Monroe, Ohio, which is just about 20 miles north of Cincinnati. And, excuse me. And so, actually, the hospital was in Middletown, which is about 30 miles north of Cincinnati. It was the same hospital where I was born, actually, Middletown Hospital. And it was a bit of a coincidence, huh? So, in essence, what happened was, I got down there around 10:30, 11 in the morning, and my sister arrived. Well, actually, my nephew got down there a little earlier. He got down about 1, and my sister got there about 2 in the afternoon. And my sister and her husband were staying over at my mother's house there on Green Tree Road, 3 miles west of Lebanon. And I guess John, my nephew, was just down sort of like, well, he could have stayed over there too, for all I know. But he got in there, and he and my mother had been sort of close, and he got all teary-eyed, so he had to leave. Well, my sister and I are both docs. You know, I'm an allopathic doc. She's an osteopathic doc. And there's nothing that terrorizes a bunch of nurses more than two family members who are docs sitting in there at the dying parent's bedside. So we sat in there and sort of tag teamed the nurses whenever they came in to see what they were doing. And we finally insisted that they shake loose her actual attending physician, and that, you know, do us and my mother the courtesy of coming in to actually lay eyes and a hand or two on her in our presence. They weren't as bad as pulling teeth, but then they weren't pulling my teeth, were they? So indeed, you know, the nurses came in, and then finally the doc came in, and we had the talk. Well, what do you want to do? At this point, my mother's sort of lapsing in and out of consciousness, but it was always hard to tell with her because, you know, she could play possum with the best of them. So you could never tell whether she was quite truly out of it or not. And we said, well, she didn't want anything extraordinary done. I mean, you know, the most she would want is to be made comfortable and you know, and ideally, and you know, then we looked over at the roommate, which had one of the noisiest families in all creation in there, and they were playing one of these afternoon women's talk shows at top volume. So, and ideally, maybe perhaps move to a quieter setting. She says, well, we could take her to the ICU, and I said, no, that's exactly what we don't want. You know, she doesn't need to go to the ICU because you're not going to do anything for her there that, you know, I mean, she basically just wants to be made comfortable. So, oh, well, we could take her down the hall to the hospice unit. I said, fine. Let's do that. And eventually, indeed, they did do that. Meanwhile, though, we got to hear the rest of the afternoon talk shows at top volume. I sat there and essentially read through the entire Gospel of John in one sitting. And just about the time I finished it, they came in to take her down to the end of the hall there. Well, end of the hall in more than one way, more than one sense, I guess. And it's interesting. The other time I had read the Gospel of John straight through without stopping was the night that she had gone into the hospital after I found her when she was 59 pounds. It's kind of an interesting little bookend situation on that one. So down the hall we went, and so this brings me to the next haiku. A mom's last 12 hours haiku. Perky nurse's aide. Sticking finger up her butt. Checking up on her. Now, she was in this was a single room and very spacious, and of course it had one of these kind of new agey murals. Actually, the new agey mural looked kind of like what I show you when I look at the creek or down my driveway. Fortunately, it didn't have some sort of god-awful poem on it. by somebody like Khalil Gibran or Oprah. No, just a picture. No religious symbols there. It's all very secular. That's all right. I'd read the Gospel of John. So, turns out that about every hour and a half, every hour and 45 minutes, this very, when I say perky, I'm not kidding. This guy was about 19 or 20. And my word, he looked like he was thinner and more emaciated than my mother when she went into the rest home. And he apparently had been assigned to come in and make sure my mother didn't have a fecal impaction. Oh, hell's fire. Doesn't matter if she's got a fecal impaction. She's going to die in a few hours. You know, leave the woman alone. But no, see, since I had learned the first rule of dealing with people in a hospital is, and the first rule is, I'd learned that in my line of work, and the first rule of dealing with people in a hospital is, don't piss off the hired help. Don't piss off the hired help. Because if you do, you're screwed, and more to the point, your loved one is screwed. Don't piss off the hired help in the hospital, period. Don't do it. You might want to, but don't do it. And so I chatted away with him whenever he came in. By about this time, we're getting on to where I'd been up, a good long time. There were many extra indurals taken that day and night, I'll tell you that right now. So, long about 11:30, 12 o'clock, he said his shift was ending, you know. I said, look, I appreciate all your attention tonight. I said, but you can tell the nurses down there when they do report and break, because I knew that's when the shift change was happening. Just tell them that, you know, absent them needing to actually do something therapeutic to my mother, and there's nothing to be done therapeutically at this point, just tell them to sort of leave us alone. In other words, at least tell them that she doesn't need to have fecal impaction checks anymore. Okay. He took that well and scampered off. And indeed, the rest of the night we weren't bothered. I, of course, did not turn on the television. My mother, at this point, had been pretty much completely unconscious for about an hour or two before she had been transferred down the hall. Well, as much as you can say somebody's completely unconscious, and certainly given her tendency to play possum. Well, I can tell you if somebody was coming in and sticking a finger up her butt, she would have complained. So she clearly had to be pretty much out of it. So around 2 o'clock, you know, my mother and I were never much for hand-holding and contact, although she did a lot of what I consider almost, well, nowadays it might be called inappropriate touching. Well, I was a kid, but it certainly wasn't sexually done. It was like, you know, what the hell is going on with you, Don? You know. She was big on taking Baraxo and sticking it up your behind. Well, I guess I guess she kind of got a payback on that the last few hours of her life. The guy wasn't using Boraxa, though. He's using KYG. Anyway, so I grabbed hold of her hand and I said, barely audibly, even to myself, I said the Lord's Prayer. When I finished the Lord's Prayer, her hand grabbed my hand really tightly. And then there was this total relaxation. Total relaxation. I'm convinced that's when she actually died. And I would, I'd check her eyes to see if the pupils were dilated and this, that, and the other, and this, that, and the other. Up to about an hour before I had done the Lord's Prayer with her, with her and God and me, I guess. Her pupils weren't completely fully dilated. There was, I can't say they were reactive, but they weren't like the big black dots you get when you're dead. And I checked her about 20 minutes after that. Total relaxation, and they were like this. And that was around 3 o'clock. So I waited till 7. And I thought, well, I checked it, and I checked it like 4 and at 5, and then a big. Now she's still breathing. She's got oxygen on. No, she's doing that sort of. Any of that sort of brainstem. She never did get any of the brainstem posturing. But she was still doing that, that agonal breathing. And excuse me, she had a pulse oximeter on there and all that. She was wearing one of these little oxygen masks. Actually, it was an little oxygen mask. So she was getting 40% oxygen. At 7:30, I thought, this is pointless. I mean, the woman's dead. So I just so I did what a lot of patients do anyway on their own, even when they're not dead. I put it up on her forehead. And in about 2 minutes, she stopped breathing. I guess that 40% oxygen was keeping those last 2 brainstem neurons alive, I guess. So she stopped breathing. She's dead. I mean, she had no pulse. I mean, she basically, hadn't had any really detectable pulse for about the last 3 hours, previous 3 hours. So, well, I need to go down and tell the nurse. This was 7:25 in the morning on September 30th, 2000. September 30th, 2000. So, now why don't you go tell the nurses here? Oh, wait a minute, they're in report. And, I went down the hall and I thought, oh, they're in report. But you don't, I'll tell you, the last thing in the world you do, unless you absolutely have to, is interrupt the nurse's report in a hospital. Oh, you never do that. first of all, to interrupt it anyway, you have to almost throw a bomb in the room. But you never do that, because they'll be down on your case for years to come after that. So I waited until they came out a report, and I came over to the head nurse, and the head nurse and I had interacted the previous day, and I said, well, my mother died at 7:25 this morning. So she got another woman to go down there, another nurse to go down there with her, and we went back down. They did the listening and the looking for the respirations and trying to find the pulse. And yeah, she's dead. And so I called my sister at great expense from the hospital room over at the house, you know, my mother's house. They had bailed out, you know. Actually, she and her husband had bailed out because, well, I know what they were doing. You know, that's neither here nor there, but they had left about about 4 or 5 in the afternoon. Maybe a little later. Maybe my sister left a little. No, about 4 or 5 in the afternoon. Not to go back to Midland, Michigan, but to go. Well, they had things they wanted to do at the house. So I took another Indrol, and then I drove home, and I almost fell asleep about 3 times on the way home. So that's the story about my mother's end of days in the rest home. But I'm convinced she basically, her soul fled to the presence of God around 2:30 in the morning. Nonetheless, the time of death is 7:25. It's like I always said in the operating room, when you get some of these people up from Southern Ohio, you can't, you know, if you wanted to kill these people, you couldn't do it with a stick. Now, I didn't want to kill I didn't kill my mother, obviously not. She was dead. I mean, this woman was dead. But, you know, it's amazing how long people live when they're dead. You know, actually brain dead. And that's like this whole thing with these so-called botched injection executions, is that, you know, I mean, I use these execution drugs that they're using professionally, and, you know, it's like anything else. It's not the drug you use, it's how you give it. You know, if you give it really slowly, and you don't give it at the right dose and high enough dose and fast enough dose, of course, you're going to end up with somebody who's basically brain dead, but breathing like that. You know, that kind of breathing. I mean, that's what happens. And so, you know, get somebody in there who knows how to give the drugs, guys. It's never been what you use, it's how you use it. It's how you give it. Well, yeah, my mother didn't have any drugs. She did that on her own. This was all soul flees into the presence of God, and you know, the pupils have been like this for about 3 hours. You're dead, boys. That's it. That's all she wrote. You ain't coming back. No more revenue to be made at the rest home from. Battery died. No more revenue to be made from the rest home, you know, from that situation. So, I know I tend to sound a little flippant in some of these little presentations, and I don't mean to be flippant at all, because obviously I'm addressing serious topics, but you know, contrary to lay opinion and popular opinion and what people might like to think, long before the vegetative brainstem functions of your brain die, you know, the part that keeps you going, the head, the part that makes you a human being, the part that makes you you, it's long gone. And it's long gone whether you die in a rest home or in a hospital setting or on the operating room table or in a car wreck, although sometimes in a car wreck those two functions pretty much get snuffed out instantaneously. Or whether you die in one of these, you know, poor man's operating rooms that passes for an execution chamber in these states that use lethal injection. It was interesting to read that the Chief Judge of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, a Court of Appeals known basically for being very left-wing, he opined, but I don't know if he wrote this in his opinion or not, but he certainly has been quoted as saying, and he gave an interview to the effect that probably the most effective way is the firing squad or maybe the guillotine. Although he said the guillotine would probably be contrary to our national ethos. The communist Chinese have the best method. They just put them in a chair and shoot them in the back of the head. Oh, there's Paul. Well, you know, and that's the fastest way and probably the most humane way. So that might be a bit contrary to our national ethos as well, although the communist Chinese tend to do it with a bit of a, sometimes they do that with a bit of a circus air, you know, with they go out to a stadium and that kind of thing and kneel these folks out in a stadium. Well, they used to. I don't know if they do now, but I imagine they do from time to time. A little re-education session for the public. That's great, isn't it? We do business with that country. Isn't it great? Isn't it wonderful? Makes you proud to be an American, doesn't it? It's all about trade flows. Maximize those returns for shareholders. Well, covered a bit more, as usual, covered a bit more territory than I generally expected to do today, but that's what happens when you've lived a rich, full life for 62 years. So, I'm going to say bye-bye, YouTubers. Finally, aren't you glad? There's essentially where I reside now, the internet.